Section 4 of Richelieu by Joseph Gustave Masson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 2, The Huguenots, Part 2. If we now look at a list of the Protestants employed by Richelieu and honoured with his confidence in the domains of literature, the name of Valentin Conrart meets us at once. It is no exaggeration to say that the minister and he were the true founders of the Académie Française. He drew up its statutes in 1635, together with the letters patent of its institution. A man of taste and of common sense, he was looked upon as an oracle by the best writers of the day, and although he wrote very little himself, yet his sound judgment could always see what were the merits or the defects of the works presented for his criticism. He was the first secretary of the Académie and retained the office till his death. It seems beyond a doubt that Richelieu's spirit of moderation contributed in no small measure to bring over several of the Huguenots to the Romish Church. Many amongst them who would have set at defiance the royal troops and the horrors of the rack and the stake were not proof against the favours of the court. We must also bear in mind that a large number of the most influential leaders had joined the Calvinists or remained with them only in hope of conquering back again the feudal independence which was the sole object of their ambition. As soon as they saw their plans frustrated, they abandoned a cause now shorn of all political importance. Richelieu had in the meanwhile seriously thought of enticing the Huguenots over to the national faith by gentle means, and by appeals to the peaceful weapons of public discussion. A certain sum of money, which he suggested to the court of the Vatican, would have been spent in bribing those amongst the dissenting pasteurs who could be won back in that way. The others would have been invited to take part in a conference led by the most celebrated divines on both sides. The Romish Church could only profit by a discussion honestly carried on with all the resources of exegetical and patristic learning. Then the result would have been drawn up in the shape of an edict, and the edict itself enforced by the secular power. The course we have thus stated was somewhat similar to that which the Emperor Charles V had proposed doing during the Augsburg interim. The Pope did not feel in the slightest degree inclined to support Richelieu's plan. He was by no means so thoroughly sure of success, and the College of Cardinals advised waiting till some tangible proofs of conversion had been obtained before venturing any further. Then the sanction of a conference on religious topics was contrary to Romish maxims, because the Church rejects all independent and national decisions respecting points of doctrine. These objections did not discourage Richelieu. We are told that he caused a number of passages from the Fathers on controverted points to be transcribed, and that he had studied them with the closest attention. He had even gone so far as to hint to some of the leading Huguenot ministers the probability of their obtaining certain important concessions, amongst others, on the vexata quaestio of the real presence. As a matter of fact, several theological works written with a view to conciliation appeared on both sides, but they were immediately denounced both by the papal nuncio and the strict Calvinists. No halting between two opinions, no facing both ways, was the cry of the uncompromising in the two camps. The ambassador Scotti, in a report which he drew up for the court of the Vatican, congratulated himself on having procured a sentence of interdiction against a number of writings which had been published advocating toleration, and on having excluded from the Paris pulpits some preachers who were advocating Richelieu's policy. The cardinal took no notice of these efforts. He persisted in believing that nothing else was needed but to caution the synods against allowing the pastors to interfere with politics, and to prevent the ministers of the foreign Protestant churches from performing their pastoral functions in France. His great aim was to make the Huguenots feel that they formed an essential part of the nation, and that as such they must be loyal subjects of the crown. So long as they adhered to this course, they would find in him a steady and resolute protector. The Huguenots, thus honestly and openly appealed to, gave unequivocal proofs that they meant sincerely to behave as true Frenchmen. During the administration both of Richelieu and of Mazarin, they firmly refused to join in any of the plots organised against the two great ministers. In 1632, for instance, the Duc de Montmorency did his utmost to secure the assistance of the Calvinists of the Cevennes. He promised them the restitution of the places of safety taken from them by Richelieu, and their free admission to all the high offices and dignities of the state, agreeably to the terms of the Edict of Nantes. All these tempting offices were made in vain, and the steady adherence of the Protestants to their duty towards the king powerfully helped to crush a movement which might have produced serious consequences. A few years later, the Protestant banker Hervat, a native of Swabia, placed his fortune at Richelieu's disposal, thus enabling him to retain the services of a body of 10,000 Swedish troops, who, for want of pay, were on the point of abandoning the French standard at the very moment when the invasion of Alsace was contemplated. His generosity was rewarded with the gift of Langres and of the forest of La Harre, which were subsequently confiscated from his family at the time of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. We alluded just now to the judicious manner in which both Richelieu and Mazarin availed themselves of the talents of able and influential Protestants. The history of Hervat illustrates this fact in a striking manner. The latter of the statesmen named above appointed him to the office of Intendant des Finances in 1650 or 1656, as some authorities have it, and not only maintained him, notwithstanding the clamours of the Romish clergy, but promoted him in 1657 to the post of Controller General. It is a melancholy thing to relate that the enlightened policy of the cardinal was vehemently opposed by most of the municipal corporations and local parliaments of the kingdom. The fact is that the religious wars of the 16th century were still in everyone's memory. The magistrates could not get rid of the belief that Protestantism was a standing menace to the realm. According to their opinions, the Edit de Grace, as well as the other declarations of the same kind made from time to time by the government, were only warnings, so to say, and hints that a return to the bosom of the Romish Church must be finally brought about. Toleration, to tell the truth, was nowhere understood, and very few of Richelieu's contemporaries would have endorsed the following maxim, which we find in one of his works: "Violent remedies only help to aggravate the diseases of the mind." This circumstance will serve to explain the extraordinary number of decrees made by bishops, parliaments, and, though less frequently, emanating from the King's Council, in evident violation of the edicts granted in favour of the Protestants. It would be tedious to give here the catalogue of these decrees. A few specimens will suffice. In 1629, the Keeper of the Seals, Michel de Marillac, published a code of laws embracing all the details of civil, ecclesiastical, criminal, naval, and financial administrations, etc., which was familiarly designated as the Code Michaud, from the name of its compiler. Article 109 of this document prohibits foreigners from preaching in France. During the same year, the Poitiers town council decided that no Protestants should henceforth be received to the masterships, maîtrise jurée, of the various trades. On the 22nd of June, 1629, the Rennes Parliament, whilst allowing Protestants leave not to decorate themselves the front of their houses with flowers and hangings on the feast of Corpus Christi and other procession days, expressly directed that these decorations should be put up for them. In 1630, October 3rd and 11th, and in 1631, June 6th, orders from council prohibited in several localities the Huguenot ministers from officiating elsewhere than in the parish where they resided, and especially enacted that they should not preach in annexes. This measure was intended to curtail the salaries of the pastors, and to induce certain localities, deprived of spiritual help, to join the Romish Church. The National Synod held at Charenton, September 1st through October 10th, 1631, protested against this outrageous measure, which was modified partly, so far as the province of Dauphiné was concerned, by another decree dated September 26th, 1633, a declaration bearing date July 23rd of the same year, ordered that the colleges and other schools founded in the Protestant cities, and which were maintained at the expense of the Protestants, should for the future be shared equally by the Catholics and the Dissenters, and that the masters and teachers should be taken from candidates belonging to either religion indifferently. Under the designation of Grand Jour, the French government was in the habit of holding, at irregular intervals, assizes in the provinces or généralités which, on account of their distance from the metropolis, often eluded the action of the central power, and became the scene of scandalous abuses and often of glaring crimes. The magistrates who constituted the bench during the meetings of these Grands Jours, being selected from the highest members of the Cour souveraine, parliaments, privy council, court of accounts, etc., offered all the guarantees of independence necessary to secure the punishment of notorious offenders. Thus we read that during the sitting of these assizes at Poitiers in 1634, a considerable number of vilains were hanged, and no less than 233 gentilshommes and other persons of rank sentenced to imprisonment and confiscation of their property, which, to quote Richelieu's own words, gave them the opportunity of taking a walk elsewhere. So far so good, and the severity of these measures produced the best possible effect. But it was perfectly iniquitous to visit with all the rigour of the law the Huguenots, who had only exercised their undoubted right of protesting against the constant violations of the Edict of Nantes sanctioned by the government. The Advocate General, Omer Talon, however, expressly said that as the prétendus réformés were merely tolerated, the affairs which concerned them, far from being interpreted and decided in the most favourable sense, should, on the contrary, uniformly receive the severest application. In accordance with this view, a decree was issued on the 4th of September, 1634, which affected the Protestant communities of Angoumois, Anjou, Aunis, Maine, Touraine, Limousin, and Périgord, and which proved of the most disastrous character. The internment of dissenters in Catholic burial grounds was strictly forbidden, under a penalty of 10,000 livres, together with the exhumation of the bodies. The Catholic services were re-established in all the churches occupied by the Huguenots. The bells of those churches could no longer be used to call the Protestants to their religious assemblies. No dissenting schools could be held except in the places especially and distinctly named in the letters patent. The noblemen belonging to the Reformed religion were compelled to declare their chief residence, in order to localize the celebration of divine worship, which besides could not be performed during their absence. No religious exercises of a public nature were allowed in the lordships, the owners of which had embraced the Romish faith. All temples erected in the cemeteries or in the immediate neighbourhood of the churches, to say nothing of those which had been built since the promulgation of the Edict of Nantes, without a duly verified permission, were closed. No preaching was tolerated in the residences of the pasteurs. The use of the word church was strictly forbidden, except when applied to the Roman Catholic establishment. A fine of 500 livres was imposed upon all those who, speaking of or alluding to the Reformed faith, should neglect to designate it as the religion prétendue réformée. These instances will serve to show the animosity which prevailed against the Huguenots, even amongst the magistracy in that portion of French society which would have naturally been regarded a priori as favourable to the maxims of wise and enlightened toleration. In Paris, it is true, the position of the dissenters was much more favourable, because Richelieu was there, and he would not have allowed any open act contrary to the maxims which characterized his policy toward the Huguenots. We must further remark that whenever the provincial parliaments had promulgated an edict affecting the rights of the religious minority, they took care to have that edict carried out before obtaining the sanction of the Supreme Council or a royal declaration. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which took place 43 years after Richelieu's death, has been often regarded as originating exclusively or almost exclusively with the influence of Madame de Maintenon and of the Jesuits acting upon the despotic nature of Louis XIV. This is a statement requiring considerable modification. We may say more correctly that the king, when he gave his consent to this unjust and impolitic act, was merely making himself the interpreter of a national error, and we should feel all the more inclined to admire the foresight and prudence of Richelieu, who, after destroying Protestantism as a political party, refused to endorse the views of those who advised him to complete his victory and to deal with the religious problem as he had done with the secular side of the question. Before bringing to an end what we have to say about the cardinal's relations with the Huguenots, we cannot too much insist upon the fact that whatever his private opinions may have been as a dignitary of the Romish Church, his fundamental maxim was the absolute independence of the civil power, and the danger of allowing an imperium in imperio. When de Bérulle and the other members of the clergy urged so repeatedly the suppression of heresy and the restoration of religious unity, their plan was to bring about not the organization of a national church, but the re-establishment of ultramontanism and the subjection of France to the authority of the Vatican. For them, the representative of God in things temporal as well as spiritual was at Rome, not at Paris, and if their line of policy had been followed, the country would have been reduced to the miserable condition to which Philip II had brought the Spanish monarchy. It would have been far better if Richelieu had seen his way to stop the proceedings of the provincial parliaments and the local magistrates in their treatment of the Huguenots, but this was impossible, and we feel very little doubt that he was anxious not to irritate or offend a body of men who shared his detestation of ultramontanist principles, and on whose efficient assistance he might depend to crush down the disciples of Loyola. The attitude assumed by Richelieu toward the Gallican Church will show that whether the interference of ecclesiastical authority in matters of statecraft came from Rome or from Geneva, it was equally contrary in his eyes to the rules of sound policy, and after having examined his dealings with the Huguenots, we must now see how he applied his principles in the administering and supervision of the national establishment. End of section 4.